So I want to acknowledge we all have so much on our minds, and I'm grateful that you have taken time out of your day to listen and chat and be present with what it is that we're going to be talking about today. And what we're focused on is we are focused on student success. And so when we think about what is student success, what is it that's driving us to have this conversation? Certainly as CTE professionals and administrators and educators and teachers, we want our students to enroll, we want them to participate, we want to complete our programs, we want them to have employment, and not only employment once they're done with our programs, but we want them to have a career path. We want them to meet those standards and develop those really critical workplace competencies. We want our students to be healthy, whole human beings who can live as their true, authentic selves. And we want them to overcome barriers, develop strong self-confidence and courage. And ultimately, I say let's let them live the life that they dream. And so as educators, all of us come to this work with a sort of different vision of what student success is. And I've worked with educators for the last decade. My background, you can read the bio on the main page. My background, I'm a trained engineer and have moved from widgets to workshops over the last decade. But in the last 11, 12 years of working with educators, I've never met an educator who at least openly admits that they intend harm on their students, right? Like we all have the greatest intentions. We want to serve our students. We want them to be successful. And we all have the best intentions in how we can serve them. I do see a link question in the chat that the link didn't work. I will check that out in just a second and make sure that we get you the resources that you need for that. And so again, what we're going to be talking about today is this notion of the impact of some of the things that happen and the ways that we communicate and the impact of our institutions and what happens within our institutions. It's way more important than our intent. We can have the best intentions, but if we aren't serving students, if we aren't helping them to meet the true student success that we aim for them, then we need to make some adjustments. And so our roadmap for today, we are going to start our conversation talking about cultural stereotypes, and then we're going to move from there to think about what is bias and what is this thing that each and every one of us hold, and then how do these biases manifest in our interactions? And through what we call micromessages, small, subtle, unconscious messages that we both send and receive when we communicate with others. And these micromessages, they accumulate in really powerful ways. They can accumulate to an advantage or a disadvantage for our students. And this accumulation affects their self-efficacy, their belief that they can accomplish a task. And that self-efficacy ultimately affects behavior. It's self-efficacy is the root of motivation. And so this behavior, if that behavior reinforces cultural stereotypes, then we've got this vicious loop. And so what we want to do as educators is to interrupt the cycle. We want to begin to recognize what are the stereotypes that I hold, what are the biases that I hold, and how is it affecting how I interact with students in a way that is negatively impacting them? And what can I do to be really intentional about providing positive micro messages that boost student success? So this is our roadmap for today, and you'll be able to see this this lens as we click through our action today. So again, this is the link that you're going to have. It's let me test it here: bit.ly/mt/ACTE. So if I click that, it is coming up for me. And so try it again and see if you can get it. Remember, it's bit.ly. And then that should help you get to the page. It looks like as a presenter, I can't ask a question to put that link in the chat for you. So again, what I want you to do is if you can go to that web page, there's a worksheet that you can download, and it can help you follow along with what we're going to be talking about today. And, and that worksheet will just kind of give you a roadmap again of what we're talking and learning about. And it has a lot of other really cool tools in that as well. I want to start with a couple of definitions for us today, just to kind of frame where we're coming from and where we're going. So you're going to hear me say the term educational equity a lot. And when I say educational equity, what I mean today is I mean that it's such that no personal or social circumstances, such as gender, our ethnic origin, or family background, should not be obstacles to achieving our educational or professional potential. And so again, we're going to be talking about this notion of equity, and it's how is it that we can provide opportunities and access for students to sort of level the playing field for them. Another key term that you're going to be hearing me say are non-traditional careers. Now, I'm sure most of you already know what this is, but again, non-traditional careers are any occupations or career fields in which people from one gender comprise less than 25% of the workforce. So again, if you go on that resource page that I provided for you, there's a CTE state fact sheet that you can download. And if you download that, then you'll see something like this. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with your data. And this is the latest data that we have from a state level around your state concentrator enrollment, excuse me, based on the different pathways. Now, if we look at this and which of these might be non-traditional for men and women, you can see based on the arrows here. So the green arrows highlight pathways that are non-traditional for women, and as is represented by your data, and the same for the blue. It's really just a reminder that there are multiple pathways where both men and women are underrepresented. And I listened in to the earlier chat today on the high demand, high wage opportunities within your state. And a lot of them are in these pathways, right? And so when we think about the fact that so many of the biggest opportunities available within your state are in these pathways, and half of our population aren't seeing that this is something for them, and they're not finding the access, and they're not persisting, and they're not staying in these pathways, then we need to do something. And so, you know, in the opening panel also, we talked a lot about the needs analysis, and this is where data really comes into play to help us understand how do we understand what's our local needs assessment, what's our local needs analysis to help us really understand how do we increase the participation of not only men and women in these non-traditional careers and pathways, but let's look and disaggregate by as many dimensions as we can. When we start talking about educational equity, I often see people kind of get glossy-eyed and a little overwhelmed, because what happens is this is a really complex issue. It's super complex, and it's affecting all along the continuum of education, both in our community and the families and their households, and pre-college and post-secondary. And a lot of times we just start thinking like, oh my gosh, it's all the things. And the answer is yes, it's all the things. But if we want to make progress, we have to focus on what we can control and where we can influence, rather than on those things in which we cannot. And I love Stephen Covey's spheres of influences here. And so if you start sort of feeling yourself pulled to that area of like, wow, like it's all of these other things that are happening and I have no control, I have no influence over those, kind of reel yourself back in, and let's spend time and energy focusing on what are those things that I can control and what are those things that I can influence to influence student success in the realm in which you work. And finally, as we start to dive in here, awareness is not enough. We must take action to begin to create systemic and useful change to serve our students. And so again, I want us to really focus on action. And so I encourage you to download those resources so that you can really be pushed past awareness to a place of action. So let's talk a little bit about labels. You know, the beginning of the school year is always an interesting time to me because there are labels everywhere. We have labels for our students based on their pathways. The students are coming with all kinds of labels of whether they're gifted, whether they're CTE, whether they're whatever pathway that they're in. We give labels based on what we see and what we hear from others as well. There are labels around demographic identity. There are labels that we prescribe based on our perceived potential of those students or their status. And so, what I want us to think about for a second are, in what ways do we use labels in our life, our community, and in our school? I want you to think about and consider, what are some of the things that you've learned about your students over the past few months of this wicked wild ride we're on as far as COVID? And in what ways do labels play a role in student experience? I heard spoken in some of the earlier sessions, as is the case across the country, that there are still so many concerns for students who are not having access to technology, they're not having access to internet. And think about, what are the ways in which we may be intentionally or unintentionally labeling students who aren't showing up, who aren't being present. If we don't have the full understanding of what's happening with those students, we can be labeling in ways that can begin to allow us to think things that may not be true, right? And so our students, they have all kinds of labels, and I want you to think about, what are the types of labels that you have for them. And if you want, you can think about, what are some of the labels that they have for you. Now, this is going to bridge us into our first conversation around cultural stereotypes. Now, stereotypes are a widely held but fixed, oversimplified, and generalized image or idea of a particular type of person or thing, including personal traits or circumstantial attributes. And stereotypes can become ideological beliefs held within one's culture that lead to assumptions about characteristics, behaviors, and social norms. And so our first step is to identify our common stereotypes and perceived notions about a place, a person, or a thing. And in truth, many of us don't yet have a sense of the literal danger involved in stereotyping and the potential for real damage to those who are subject to it. So knowing when and how a stereotype developed can help us reveal hidden assumptions. And so let's look for fun, right? So in the few minutes that you've known me, you've learned a couple of things. You learned that I'm from Texas. You learned that I'm an engineer, and I'm your speaker today, right? You could make up all kinds of assumptions about these kinds of things, right? We have loads of assumptions about Texans. There are loads of assumptions and stereotypes about engineers. And I'm sure there are loads of stereotypes about people who do this crazy thing of sitting at their computer and giving keynote speeches, right? So we could come up with all kinds of stereotypes. I know, as I've traveled the excuse me, as I've traveled the world, one time I was on vacation and I was on a really small island in the Indian Ocean. And I'm not kidding, within a 24-hour period, I had no less than 6 different families ask me if all Texans owned a gun. Right? Now, that's kind of a, weird thing to ask someone that you just meet, but to them, in the worlds that they live in, now most of the people who were traveling there were from Australia and Europe. And so to them, like, that was such a strange thing of like, is it true that all Americans have, or all Texans have guns, right? And I have to say, I did notice, and one of the speakers this morning had a gun in his backdrop, and I thought, only in Montana. But then I thought, it's going to happen in Texas too, right? And so we have these stereotypes, and people sometimes make all kinds of assumptions related to those, right? So what we're going to do is, I'm going to have some images, and these images are going to try to tell a story, a theme here. And I want you to think about, look at the image. I'm going to describe it to you, but I want you to kind of try to be interactive as much as you can wherever you're seated. And think about, what are some of the stereotypes that you recognize or attribute to these images. Now, these are real images, didn't make them up, but let's have a look. So this first set of images are from a Lands' End catalog, and the fine print isn't important. Don't worry about that. But the image is of a red satchel bag. It's got the name Matthew monogrammed on it, and it's got a soccer ball. And then there's a backpack version sitting next to it. It's got some books in the bag and a little shark flashlight LED keychain. And then the heading there says super light, superhero tough. So when we look at this image, what are some of the stereotypes that we think of? We might think it's for a boy. We might think it's from a boy from a certain socioeconomic status where their mom or dad or aunt or uncle or somebody is like buying them monogrammed, bags. We look at the shark, and as a scuba diver, I try to negate these stereotypes, but people think that sharks are so scary and that they're so aggressive, and generally they're not, unless you're like, throwing chum in the water next to them. And so there's sort of a symbol of aggression and relates that to boys, teen boys. We've got this sort of superhero tough kind of image that comes with so many young boys. Now look at what was on the next page. This is a bag that is like a purple sort of digital checked. It's got the name Chloe monogrammed on it. It doesn't have a soccer ball or anything like that. In the backpack version, no books, no shark, flashlight, keychain. It's got a water bottle in it. And the heading here says light as a feather, tough as long division. So we can look at the stereotypes and think it might be for a girl, again, from a higher socioeconomic status. We can sort of wonder, like, why are there no books? Does she not need to study? Maybe she just needs the water for her hydration, right? I don't know. It's better for the skin. But the thing that like kills me is like the tough is long division. It makes this assumption that the math is too tough for girls, right? Or this notion of light as a feather. It really plays to cultural stereotypes that girls aren't strong and that girls should take up less space. Now let's look at the next set of images that continue on this same theme. These are t-shirts. I did not make these up. The one in the top left says, I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me. The next one says allergic to algebra in the bottom left. And then the top right says, I'm too pretty to do math. The one on the bottom right says, who needs math when you're already a 10? And then the middle one says, my best subjects, shopping, check, music, check, dancing, check, math, well, nobody's perfect. So what are the stereotypes that we see in these images? We certainly see the perpetuated stereotype that girls don't do math. We see this sort of contrast and this sort of polarity of like brains versus beauty. We see that there's a sort of value system placed on how it's much more important to be pretty than it is to be smart. And so again, we can certainly make an assumption based on the colors that these are more likely targeted for girls, right? Now, again, stick with me. I've got one last set of images. In this set of images, it starts with the cartoon character of Dilbert. Now, Dilbert has become somewhat of the, archetype of what it means to be a STEM, an engineer, or as a professional within technology. And then we've got that same sort of archetype really perpetuated and mimicked in the Geek Squad, which they are this the crew of people who come fix your computer from Best Buy, and then also perpetuated within the cast of The Big Bang Theory. And so when I look at this image and I think about the caricature of Dilbert, I see my dad and I see my granddad. Both my dad and my granddad are computer scientists. They're both white guys. And I remember this time I was in junior high and I was doing some kind of project where you had to like go through all the photos and create some sort of portfolio or whatever. And I found this photo of my dad, and he had on a white short sleeve shirt. He didn't have a flippy tie, but he had on suspenders. And he had on like black high water pants, loafers. He had a pocket protector, which by the way, you can get these at like Home Depot and Lowe's. They're still useful today, apparently. And he had on like thick Buddy Holly glasses, literally with tape on them. And I was like, Dad, this is hilarious. Like, is this your Halloween costume? And he looks at me and crosses his arms and like nods. And he's like, no, it's not my Halloween costume. And so while he's got a little bit more style now, my granddad still dresses like this, right? And when we look at old films like Hidden Figures, it's not an old film, but it's a film about, previous time. We see that like all of the men in the NASA program, like they all dress like this. This is sort of the uniform for the engineers. And so this archetype, this stereotype has been perpetuated. And again, I'm trying to kind of create this theme of who belongs in STEM. Within this archetype is sort of the awkward, that's generally a male, sort of antisocial, lax style. These stereotypes that have been perpetuated and that are really sort of curated from very early on, stereotypes that are created and nurtured. Now, the thing about stereotypes is that they aren't always untrue. And so this is a quote from Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story, and it's linked from the resource page that I provided you. And she says, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, it's that they're incomplete. They make that one story become the only story. And so we know this to be true, right? Like there are some engineers who hold the archetype and match the archetype of the Dilbert character. My dad, my granddad. In fact, my aunt is an electrical engineer. And while she is a woman, she also matches some of the identity of those engineer characters of kind of awkward, a little antisocial, sort of black style. And so while she still fits that identity, I remember for me as a child and as a teen growing up, I thought, if that's what it means to be an engineer, I'm not signing up for that, right? Like I had different dreams and different vision for my future. And I thought, I don't fit that mold. And so what we have to think about is how do we begin to change the narrative? What is the sort of single story that's being told about your career and your pathway that you're working in? If you are an administrator, think about what's happening at your school. What is the single story that's told about students in CTE pathways? What's the single story told about students who aren't choosing four-year degrees? What's the single story that's being told about men who go in nurses, women who go into technology pathways, right? We have to think about what are those single stories and how do we begin to challenge and disrupt some of the ways that these messages are potentially excluding students from these opportunities and pathways. So I've got a little take home. I know I have zero power over you, but I do recommend if you want to watch that TED Talk, you can find it linked from the URL that I provided and do a little reflection. Think about what is the danger of the single story? And then think about what is she talking about around power? And then really think about what does this mean for you in your role, whatever role that might be. So again, my request is that you take this as an action item. So now let's make a connection of how these stereotypes become biases. Now, I have to tell you, so my college roommate from my master's degree, she's from Montana. She's from a small town called Plevna. If anybody's from Plevna, you probably know the Sparks. And so I remember when we were, again, just sort of like randomly matched roommates. And one night we were at a party. And so somebody, I don't know, it's Texas, right? And somebody's like, asking questions about chickens and they're trying to like create some kind of egg production in their local community or whatever. And I was like, oh, well, you should talk to my friend Katie. She knows all about eggs. And Katie turns around and she's like, what? I don't know anything about eggs. I was like, Katie, you have a whole degree in eggs. And she's like, no, I don't. She's like, I have a degree in egg. I was like, yeah, eggs. And she's like, no, egg. And I was like, I don't know what you're saying, but I feel like we're saying the same thing. She's like, no, agriculture. And I was like, OMG, of course you don't get a degree in eggs. That's just silly. But for a long time, I thought my best friend had a degree in eggs. But she, in fact, had a degree in agriculture. And when I was talking to Mark a few weeks ago, and he was telling me about the people who are going to be here, he mentioned egg. And so it certainly like reminded me of the story. But the story plays a part with what we're trying to talk about today and how our brains function and think about different words and think about different sort of images. So I, growing up, did not know many people who said egg like egg. I had never heard agriculture said in that kind of way. And so there was no schema in my mind that could understand what she was saying. I just assumed that whatever she was saying was eggs, as in the eggs that are in our fridge, because that's the only, again, schema in which would match my brain and picture of this. And so let me give you another example of a schema based on eggs. So years ago, I was at a conference and I was exhibiting. And so, I had like a booth and I was telling people about NAPE's programs. And I was also presenting at this. And, generally when you go to conferences in person, they're busy and bustling and you're doing lots of networking and you're sort of pulled in lots of directions, or at least this is how I feel, because I love events like that. And I remember that they, in the opening session, the sort of MC or whatever said, and oh, by the way, look in your swag bag. So everybody got like this bag of goodies. And if you see an egg in it, then you win a $1,000 grant for your organization. And I was in a hurry. I was like kind of stressed, trying to juggle all the things. And I remember I looked in my bag, I looked in, and I was thinking, I'm not going to find an egg like this. I was like, I'm going to find an egg like an Easter egg, right? And so I look in my bag, I don't see an Easter egg of any sort. And then I go home and I'm like relaxing and like going through the bag, and I see like business cards and I see, other kinds of trinkets that people had given me, pens and whatnot. And then I see this. It's the stuffed thing that's got a little crown and like two orange legs. And I'm like, well, what is this? And then there's a book in my bag. And I read the book. It's a book by Kobe Yamada, and it's called What Do You Do with an Idea? It's a great book. I really recommend it. And I read this book, and like within the first page, I was like, oh my God, this is $1,000 egg. So I called the conference people and I was like, I have the egg. And they're like, oh, it's too late. Sorry. And so when I think about what happened, right? So in my brain, I held a schema, a sort of map of what does an egg look like. I thought an egg could look like this, like an Easter egg. I thought an egg could be something that was out of the grocery store, out of my parents' chicken hen. But nowhere in my schema did an egg, was it furry and had a crown and two orange legs. Like there was nothing in my schema. And so what happens in our brain is that single stories become schemas. And a schema, it describes a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationships among them. And so we might have single stories about engineers. We might have single stories and schemas about eggs. We might have single stories and schemas about CTE students. We might have single stories and schemas about Texans. But again, these are a pattern of information that happen in our brain. And these patterns are drawn upon more often when we are tired, stressed, or in a hurry. Tell me this doesn't describe any of you, right? No, right? You're never tired. You're never stressed. You're never in a hurry, right? I'm sure that this is not true. And unfortunately, in this bizarre time that we're in, I'm sure this is describing all of us. So what that means is that when we are tired, stressed, in a hurry, hungry, distracted, that our brain has a greater likelihood of drawing on those distractions. Now, let me give you another example of a misplaced schema. So when I was working as an engineer for Texas Instruments years ago, and it was take your kids to work day, and we had planned this whole thing. Now, I don't have any kids, but I was super excited to create some kind of program that would help the kids understand what is engineering and what is it that we did within our digital light processing group. And so we designed this whole skit, and it was a skit on how does the digital micro mirror device work. I'm trying to pull it up on my desk here. It's kind of tucked away. And so it was a skit where we were like, as humans, acting out, how does this chip work? And this goes in projectors like in the movie theater or in your office. Now, I helped write the thing, and I was the main actress. And then afterwards, this girl comes up to me. She was probably about 10 or 11. And she's standing and chatting with me, and her dad's like right behind her, but chatting to someone else. And she's like, so do you work in the cafeteria? And I was like, no, I don't work in the cafeteria. I'm an engineer. Like, how did you miss that in this skit, right? Like, we're all engineers. And I remember like sort of reflecting afterwards, like, how on earth did she make a connection that I work in a cafeteria rather than be an engineer like her dad? And we were in the cafeteria, right? So we were in the sort of lunch area. We weren't like where it the served food, but in the sort of seating area. And so for this young girl, she had schemas of what an engineer looked like. They look like her dad. They did not look like a young, 20 something woman. And maybe I challenged some of the stereotypes of what her dad's friends were like too, right? But again, her schema was that does not compute. She cannot be an engineer, right? And so what I hope has changed is now she has a more broadened schema of what an engineer is, because I challenged that stereotype, right? Now let's practice this. This is always an interesting experiment that we're going to do. And again, I have no way of getting feedback from you. And so I'm just going to trust that you're going to do this with me. But again, where I do this in different places across the country, some people see it differently than others. So I've got this image here. I want you to look at it, and I'm going to keep it up on the screen for a few seconds. Like, what do you see when you look at this image? Some people say they see a satellite. Some people say they see a map. Some people say they see like a cat on a rug. Some people say they see a lady getting her hair done. Excuse me. People say they see all kinds of things. But what it is, and I guess I wish I could hear your feedback in person, but what it is a cow. Now, I hold a stereotype. You can't see me put my hand on my hip, that Montana people know a lot about cows. And the reason is because my roommate from college, she owns like a homesteaded ranch. So she knows a lot about cows. Now, after having lived with Katie for a few years, my schema of cows is greatly increased. Because the only kind of schema of a cow I knew about growing up looks like Daisy the dairy cow. I grew up in a rural village, but our economy was based on tall pine trees turning them into paper, not cows. And so when you look at this, so you can see, let's see if I can show the pointer here. This is the ear, and then the bridge of the nose, and then the eye, and then the ear here. Now, what the research tells us about this is that 90% of you will not see the cow at first, and a third of you still don't see it. And many people won't see it until viewing the photo multiple times. But what I have found is that sometimes in more rural communities, people who have broader schemas of what a cow is are more likely to see it. And so the truth is that, however, once you see it, you're more likely to keep seeing it. And so what I want you to think about is to reflect on a time when your single story or a limited schema was incorrect about a student. What happened as a result? How could the scenario have played out differently if you hadn't held a single story about that student? Now, again, the single story could be any number of things. I know as we're facing this sort of bizarre online learning environment, it's easy to make assumptions about our students, right? They're not paying attention, they're not participating, they are insert any number of assumptions, right? But we really don't know what's going on. We really don't know the level in which they're participating, in which they're engaged, in which we're listening. And sometimes we can really be proved wrong. I just found out yesterday that there was a gentleman who attended, I did like a year-long program with a school in Illinois, with a group of schools in Illinois. And this one gentleman, I have to say, I sort of marked him off as like not a good student because he didn't come all the time. And I just heard yesterday somebody forwarded me the news from this Illinois community that he's now like this liaison of, educational equity between the city and like the school. And I thought, wow, like that's amazing. Like maybe he really was paying attention, or he was so busy doing other things, right? So we can make these assumptions about people, we can label them, and it can affect how we interact with them, right? Like that's the key thing, is how does it change how we're interacting with people? And so these prejudices, these stereotypes, and consequently bias, they often operate in combination to influence our behavior. And the truth is like there's deep neuroscience on this. I'm not going to go into all the neuroscience today, but I do encourage you to watch a video I'll link to you later. But there are networks in our brain that support the learning, experience, expression of prejudice, and the storage, activation, and behavioral expression of stereotypes. So if you have a brain, this is happening, right? So if you don't have a brain, then it's not happening, right? But I'm certain all of us have these brains, and so all of us have this that's happening. And so as a reminder, prejudice, that is a preconceived opinion that's not based on reason or actual experience. And bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, group compared with another, usually considered in a way to be unfair. Now, there are two types of bias. There is explicit bias, which is when it's referring to your attitudes or stereotypes that affect your understanding in a conscious manner. That's explicit. It's in a conscious manner. But we're talking about today implicit bias. This is what refers to our attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding in ways that we are unconscious of, right? It's those unconscious schemas that are affecting how we interact with others. Now, there's some really good news here. So the good news is that while there are networks in the brain that support the holding of prejudice and the holding of stereotypes, there are also networks in the brain that support the self-regulation of these things. So with the self-regulation of our cognitive control, we can reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. Like, that's good news. We can do something about it. And that's what we're really talking about today. So let me give you an example from a research study. This is an example around gender bias. So in 1970, females represented less than 5% of symphony orchestras in the United States. So whoever the like symphony orchestra people are, they thought, well, if we implement blind auditions, would it increase the participation, the representation of women in the orchestra? Now, think about where symphonies take place and where tryouts might take place. This is the beautiful Bass Performance Hall in Fort Worth, Texas. And so a stage is made out of what? Wood. And what do many people wear on important days like tryouts? Fancy shoes. So for women, they might wear heels. And so what they found is they implemented a blind audition. So they like put up a wall, but then they didn't get the results that they wanted. And so they began to look at and like figure out, well, what happened? Like we were trying to not be biased. They realized that the subtle click-clacking of heels triggered deeply rooted unconscious stereotypes about women, about whether they belong, whether they could like hang out, have a beer, whether they were gonna like, quit and go have all these other responsibilities. It loaded in all of those stereotypes, and they unconsciously didn't select women. So then what they did is they put down carpet. So it muted the sound of the shoes. And so once a true blind audition was implemented, by the mid-90s, female participation increased to 25%. And then a recent study in 2013 showed that 30% of women in the other 30% of women in symphony orchestra. Now, they're not at parity for a variety of other sort of systemic institutional kinds of reasons. But again, I want us to think about, in what instances do we need to like put up a wall or lay down carpet to help us not have bias in how we're selecting, how we're grading, how we're encouraging people to go into different kinds of pathways, right? And so how we can use the brain science to help us challenge this is to expand our schemas to reduce unconscious bias. Now, I wouldn't be a good engineer if we didn't talk about some math here. I already gave you the equation impact is greater than intent. Now we're going to do a little bit of probability and statistics. I have to say, this was not my forte as a student. But what we're talking about here, when we're trying to expand our schemas to reduce unconscious bias, this is a probability statement. So think about, instead of a standard 52 card deck, you have a deck with 47 red sevens and 5 other random cards. And so in this instant, the red sevens represent those single stories, stereotypes, or like a narrow schema. So the probability that your brain accesses a red 7/stereotype is 47 out of 52, or 9 out of 10 times. So if you have 47 schemas that engineers look like my dad and only 5 other random them, the probability of your brain accessing that stereotype is 9 out of 10 times. Now, if you have a standard 52 card deck, you only have 2 red 7s and 50 other cards. And again, in this case, the red 7s represent the stereotypes. So in this instant, the probability that your brain accesses a red 7 or stereotype is only about 1 out of 25 times. So by expanding the images, expanding our schemas, creating more stories in our brain, it reduces the probability that our brain is going to access unconsciously these different kinds of information. So whether you hold stereotypes again about your students, we have to begin to increase those stories to challenge the messages. So again, if you want to learn more about this, then you can watch a webinar on my website, and then there's a handout with some definitions there. And so there is something that you can do here. You can explore, take an implicit association test. And again, you can look at that from the website and understand what are some of the biases that you have. And awareness is the first step, right? It's not meant to condemn you. It's just to say like, hey, maybe I have this bias. What are some self-regulation things that I can start to do to reduce the impact of those biases? Now, these biases, they manifest in our interactions through what we call micromessages. These micromessages are small, subtle, unconscious messages that we both send and receive when we communicate with others. And there are 2 types of micromessages. The first are microaffirmations. These build students up. These make students feel valued, included, encouraged. They are always positive, and they can be intentional. That's what we want to do. We want to have intentional messages. The other kind of micro messages are micro inequities. These make students feel excluded, devalued, discouraged. They're always negative and always unintentional. If you're sending intentional messages that do this to students, that's explicit bias. And I think it's like technically against the law as educators, right? So we're not talking about that. We're talking about those unconscious messages that we don't realize that we're sending. And there are 6 types of micro messages. Now, the first type of micro message is verbal. This is simply what is said. These are the sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Like, these are the words that are being said. Paraverbal is how it's said. It's if you've ever told your kid, your partner, your student, whomever, to watch your tone, you're talking about the paraverbal, the way that it's said. Nonverbal, this is our body language. It's the cues and messages that we're giving as related. Are we interacting with all of our students in the same kind of way? And what's the message that could be received if we interact with some students differently? Contextual and omission, I like to talk about together because it's what is there or not there, or what's said or what's not said. And then the final type of micro messages are the ways in which we give feedback. Now, let's do some examples here. So say that in our classrooms, we use a consistent use of a generic key, manner, guise to represent everyone, both men and women. Now, everybody says it's a colloquialism, it's normal, it's like, it's just what we all say. And I have to say, as a Texan, I learned very early on to get rid of my accent because it triggered people's bias about my intelligence. And one of the things I did is try to stop saying y'all. And so I started saying guys, and now it's just really hard to stop saying guys. So I get it. It's hard to change. But if we have this consistent use of the generic he, man, or guys to represent both men and women, what that is a verbal cue. And how it could be received is that female students are invisible or unimportant, or they don't belong. Now, again, it's when is this salient? If I'm the only female in a class full of 70 male students, which that has happened before in my electrical circuits class, my electrical engineering circuits class, and the teacher keeps saying, hey guys, hey guys, hey guys, and I know, like, I clearly don't belong here because I'm the only one that's different. It's a way that my brain is unconsciously filing every time it's said, I don't belong here. I don't belong. And it's not because I'm not tough. It's not because I'm like, taking this so personally. My brain is unconsciously filing this bit of information in my brain that is going to affect my belief of whether I belong there, whether I want to stay there, or whether I want to persist. Excuse me. Now, the next example is if we are selecting class materials and textbooks without vetting for gender or racial inequities and stereotypes. The kind of message that this is a contextual or omission. And so we have to ask ourselves is like, what's the message that could be received as a result of this micromessage? It could be that females and Black, Indigenous people of color don't have the intellectual capacity to contribute. And we know that's not true. But if we don't vet our materials, then it could be sending that message. Excuse me. My little brother is a high school history teacher. And his very first year of teaching, he called me and said, Meagan, you're gonna be so proud of me. He's like, I have planned an entire day of women in history. And I take my job as his big sister, like super important. And like, I feel like part of that job is to like bust his chops. And I was like, that's terrible, Stephen. What are you talking about? And he's like, no, you told me like this was super important. And I was like, okay, it is super important. However, you have to tell your students why you only have one day of women in history, because you could actually send the opposite message. If you don't qualify and like explain, I had to do extra work to bring in the stories of women in history because they weren't written into the textbooks and it doesn't reflect their contribution to our world and our history. Again, it could send that opposite message. I think he's up to 2 days now. So he is making some improvement. So many of us might think, we might not know the ways that we're sending micromessages in our environment. And there's a peer observation protocol that you can download. And I know like if we're in a virtual environment, like it makes it even harder. The peer observation protocol is not written for the virtual space, but it could still give you some tips on how to conduct a peer observation, because you don't know what you don't know. And if you have a trusted colleague review, then you can begin to learn about some of the ways that this is happening in your environment. So this accumulation of messages is what's so important. Now, I've got a little cartoon here, and it's got a couple of eagles sitting in some chairs sipping tea. And in the first one slide on the left, the eagle says, do you think the owl is a predator? And the one reading the paper's thinking, and then he responds, well, of course not. He's never bothered me. And the original eagle says, exactly. And then we go to them just sitting and sipping. And then the original eagle says, I have no idea what Mr. Mouse was going on about. See, this is the thing with micromessages. They might not be happening to you. And if they're not happening to you, you might say, I don't know why the mouse thinks that the owl is a predator, because the owl's not bothering me. But just because the owl's not bothering you doesn't mean that he's not a predator of the mouse. And this is how micromessages happen. And they accumulate in really powerful ways to affect our students. And so they can accumulate to an advantage or a disadvantage. Another way of looking at this is like mosquito bites. There's a link to a video on the resource page that microaggressions are like mosquito bites. I encourage you to watch it. Fair warning, there's one curse word in it, but it's still a really good video to help you understand this accumulation of messages. If the mosquitoes don't like you, but they really like your neighbor and they're bothering your neighbor, if you're getting swarmed by mosquitoes, it really begins to affect whether you want to hang out outside. But you could be sitting there drinking your cocktail saying, I don't know what the problem is. It's fine for me. And again, we have to begin to recognize that it's sort of the death by 1,000 cuts. The death by 1,000 cuts is that, if you get one, it's not a big deal, but it's an accumulation of messages in an unconscious way that affects our students' self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is your belief and your ability to perform a specific task. And it answers the question, can I do this? And it's always task-based. It could be a specific task, a simple task, a complex task, or any kind of task, but it's always task-based. And a student who has the high self-efficacy, they're more likely to have greater achievement, interest, motivation, performance, persistence. These are all the things that we want from our students, right? This is that student success that we're hoping for. And a student who has this high self-efficacy, they're more likely to adopt more and more challenging goals. And a person with a low self-efficacy, they're more likely to doubt, fear, and avoid tasks. And a person with a low self-efficacy, they're more likely to avoid challenges. And so again, what we want to do is figure out, how do we be really intentional about providing feedback to creating environments that boost our students' self-efficacy so that we get these results, so that they have that greater interest, achievement, motivation, performance, persistence, and that they take on more and more challenging goals. And so again, I encourage you to download the Awareness to Action Planning and Commitment Worksheet. It's got loads of strategies, some of which I talked about today, a lot of which that I couldn't cover in such a brief time. But use this as a way to recap some of the things that I have talked about, and to create, there's a tool in there where you can do a sort of self-assessment. It's an equity reflection to kind of see, where do you stand as an equity professional, moving from novice to someone who is an expert in modeling these kinds of behaviors. And I encourage you to complete the commitment form, where it really summarizes all the key things that I've talked about today. Now, in summary, at heart, what we're talking about today, we are talking about student success. And when we think about our students, we have to think about it through the lens of educational equity and how it's impacted by all of the different things that we talked about today. Starting with cultural stereotypes and how these stereotypes exist about each and every identity, pieces of our identity, each and every part of who we are and where we come from, and the things that we like to do and don't like to do. And these stereotypes can become implicit biases that all of us hold in our brain. And we have to begin to recognize, what are these prejudices and biases, and how are they manifesting in our interactions and impacting how we're communicating, how we're teaching, how we're advising, how we're encouraging students and their pathways. And remember, there are two types of micromessages. We want to have those intentional micromessages that build students up. We want them to feel valued, included, and encouraged. And these messages, we need to be intentional about them so that they build up and accumulate in such a positive way that affects student self-efficacy, so that they think, I can do this. I can become an engineer, I can become a nurse, I can finish this pathway, I can choose this career, I can do any of the things that we're trying to get them to wish they want to do. And that affects their behavior. And remember, we get to interrupt the cycle by examining our stereotypes, examining our biases, and being really intentional about the micro messages that we send and how we communicate with our students. Now, again, I encourage you to download the packet. There are tons of strategies listed in that. Kind of a recap of what we talked about. Take an implicit association test. Awareness is the first step. Actively challenge stereotypes. Do not let stereotypes persist. We have to interrupt the cycle. Expand your schemas to reduce unconscious biases. We want to be intentional about micro affirmations. Conduct a peer observation. develop a networked improvement community or a peer mentoring group. So today, however many of you are listening and tuning in, you now have a shared vocabulary. Keep talking about this. If we want to continue the conversation, we have to keep talking about it. And then finally, we have to listen. We have to listen to our students. We have to observe. And just because something's not happening to us, just because we don't see and personally experience and feel it, doesn't mean it's not affecting our students. And I'll leave you with one of my new favorite Dr. Seuss quotes. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And I have hope that through all of the work that we do together, we really can make a difference and impact our students' lives and help encourage them to reach their potential, encourage them to choose pathways that might challenge some of the cultural stereotypes that they are raised with, but to go into high demand, high wage, rewarding careers that not only change their lives, but change the trajectory of their families' lives. And so I want to thank you for your time today and what you've invested in learning. And I don't see any questions. Jenny, do you see any questions?
Nope. Nope. Just other than the what advice would you give on how to start the hard conversation with leaders to begin disrupting the way we've always done it thinking?
Oh, I see that now. Thank you. So I think one of the hardest things that we face is power dynamics, right? And so if we're trying to talk to our educators, and I think one of the easiest ways to have a conversation is to start with questions. And if you keep asking someone questions of like, well, tell me why we need to keep doing that. And who is that serving? And who is that not serving? And if you keep asking them questions and you let them unpack their illogical plan, then it's sort of like reverse psychology, right? Now it's like their idea and you didn't have to tell them and correct them. And so that's one way to have some of those hard conversations. And one of the resources on the webpage that I provided for you is called Moving from Debate to Dialogue. That's another resource to get you to kind of think about how do we initiate some of these hard conversations? Because many of us Americans who are raised in a sort of the individualistic kind of way, we're conditioned to debate and discuss things, but that's really not the most productive way to get us to make change. And so that sort of framework in there helps us to think about how do we move to dialogue where we can kind of come together and have that shared intent. And so again, you can also start with a notion of student success. If you start with a notion of student success and say, don't we all agree that we want to help each and every student be successful? Nobody's going to say no to that, right? Like they're never going to say no to that. And so you can start your conversation thread with that outcome in mind. And that can help you to kind of have some of those hard conversations. And I'm happy to talk with you more. My contact information is here. You're welcome to reach out to me if you want to ask any more questions about that.